The Jedi Order is usually cast as disinterested guardians of peace, but a closer look shows an organization whose beliefs and structures created predictable blind spots that helped bring about its own failure. Rigid doctrine about attachment and emotion encouraged emotional isolation and moral certainty. A secretive, hierarchical leadership concentrated information and limited dissent. And deep political entanglement with the Republic turned peacekeepers into military leaders. Those three features didn't just complicate the Jedi's work, they reshaped their decisions, limited their judgment, and made the Order vulnerable to manipulation. Understanding the Jedi isn't a matter of condemning individual members or celebrating false villains. It's about seeing how institutional incentives and cultural norms produced outcomes the Order's mythology never accounted for. In the sections that follow, the focus will be on how doctrine, culture, and politics interacted in practice, how what the Jedi believed about themselves changed their behavior, how secrecy narrowed their options, and how political compromise turned a spiritual order into an arm of state power. The result is a different picture, an order that helped guard the galaxy and, at key moments, made choices that deepened the crises it aimed to prevent. To understand why the Jedi Order failed, start with what it asked of its members. Jedi doctrine and institutions were not neutral tools. They prescribed who a Jedi should be, how to feel, and who would decide for them. Early child recruitment, a strict ban on attachment, institutionalized emotional restraint, a small, centralized council, and a stark light versus dark moralism did more than shape behavior. They produced predictable blind spots that warped judgment, shut down accountability, and left the Order brittle long before the Clone Wars. Child recruitment is the clearest example. The Order identified and removed force-sensitive children early, often separating them permanently from parents and cultures. The rationale was explicit. Train candidates before ties hardened, so attachment wouldn't interfere with service. In practice, whole generations were raised inside the temple, learning a narrow vocabulary of right and wrong and internalizing detachment as the proper emotional stance. That produced disciplined, powerful practitioners, but also social and relational deficits. Many Jedi lacked experience with family life, long-term commitments, or the compromises of civilian politics. When someone like Anakin Skywalker, discovered outside the Order, didn't fit that mold, the mismatch became a fault line. The Order prevented attachment rather than building systems to integrate exceptions, crises, or trauma that fell outside its prescribed path. The formal ban on attachment was intended to guard against fear, jealousy, and control. Attachment could lead to fear of loss, fear to anger, anger to the dark side. But insisting on avoidance over emotional literacy created incentives for secrecy. Anakin's secret marriage to Padme is the obvious consequence. Hidden attachments become leverage. They breed guilt, fear, and desperation, the very states the Code sought to prevent. Prohibiting the thing meant to be protected left the Order ill-equipped to help members whose commitments emerged anyway. Training reinforced that problem. Jedi practice emphasized meditation, dispassion, and the suppression of fear and anger. Officially, feelings were to be acknowledged but not acted on. In practice, culture favored suppression. Emotional literacy, recognizing, contextualizing, and working through grief or guilt, was underdeveloped. When Anakin suffered his mother's murder and later feared losing Padme, the Order's response was doctrinal rather than clinical, moralizing the pain instead of providing ways to process it. Suppression became avoidance. Avoidance fostered secrecy and resentment. The Order's governance amplified these cultural faults. A small, centralized council concentrated decision-making in the temple on Coruscant. That created consistency and efficiency, but also groupthink and limited dissent. Minority views, Qui-Gon Jinn's emphasis on the living force, for example, existed, yet the council's prestige and procedures insulated policy from robust challenge. Training, assignments, and political engagement were often decided with limited debate and proved hard to revisit when they failed. An institutional inclination to trust its own judgment, combined with procedural opacity, reduced the order's capacity for self-correction. That opacity extended outward. The temple's independence and the council's privileged access to intelligence let the order operate apart from ordinary public oversight. Useful in crises, this autonomy also meant fewer external checks. Misjudgments, misreading a student, underestimating a threat, or aligning with a flawed political partner, tended to be treated internally rather than publicly owned. Habits of secrecy discouraged transparency and amplified the costs of poor decisions. The Order's moral framework made nuance even harder to see. Presenting the galaxy in terms of light and dark produced moral absolutism. People were framed as aligned with the light or corrupted by darkness, and emotion was often treated as an indicator of moral failure. That binary leaves little room for ambiguous motives, political negotiation, or rehabilitation. Problems that might be systemic or correctable became questions of character. Responses skewed toward ostracism and punishment rather than understanding or remedial action. Political actors could and did exploit those certainties. Taken together, early recruitment, prohibition of attachment, emotional suppression, concentrated council authority, and a black and white ethic didn't just shape Jedi personalities, they reconfigured the Order's collective cognition. Members were trained to value detachment and doctrinal purity over emotional nuance. Leaders were rewarded for confident judgment rather than soliciting critique. Institutional mechanisms favored secrecy and policing over restorative processes. The result was an organization fit for many peacekeeping tasks, but fragile when confronted with political manipulation and the emotional realities of its own people. Seen this way, later events look less like inexplicable moral collapse and more like the predictable outcome of institutional incentives and cultural habits. The Temple's emphasis on purity and control made it less able to adapt to an era of war and politics. That structural brittleness is the thread that runs into the Clone Wars, where militarized conflict exposed and widened pre-existing faults. The Clone Wars didn't break the Jedi overnight. It exposed how decades of training and moral strictures had reshaped a peacekeeping culture into an institution poorly suited to command, political negotiation, or the compromises of total war. Most visibly, Jedi became generals. A corps trained for mediation, diplomacy, and restraint was handed operational control of a standing army and sent to lead campaigns across dozens of worlds. That change was more than technical. As battlefield commanders, the Jedi had to make decisions about sieges, targets, alliances, and sacrifice that were political as well as tactical. They became answerable to the Republic's executive strategy, which shifted wartime expediency ahead of the deliberative restraint the Order prized. And commanding troops normalized organized violence as a routine instrument of policy, blurring the line between defending peace and prosecuting war, both inside the Order and in the public eye. Those pressures collided with pre-existing cultural habits. The Jedi Code's distrust of attachment and its framing of passion as moral danger made navigating the emotional and political realities of war difficult. Anakin Skywalker is the clearest example. The Council's pattern of public refusals and private demands, promoting him to the Council's inner circle without granting him the rank of Master, asking him to spy on the Chancellor while withholding the recognition he wanted, produced resentment. When he brought fear for Padme and suspicion about Palpatine to the Council, they responded with secrecy and caution rather than transparent support or therapeutic intervention. Rewarding obedience while punishing emotional expression became an institutional blind spot that left a talented but troubled Jedi vulnerable to manipulation. Secrecy and centralized decision-making deepened that vulnerability. The origin of the clone army is instructive. Grown on Kamino at the request of a supposedly rogue Jedi, later manipulated by Count Dooku and the Sith, its existence was unknown to most of the Order for years. Obi-Wan's discovery of Kamino is the moment the Jedi realized they had been sent to command a force they neither authorized nor fully controlled. They were made de facto military leaders without full information about their troops' origins, conditioning, or command structure. They accepted responsibility for the army's use while lacking the political oversight and technical knowledge needed to manage it effectively. That gap allowed political actors to exploit the order. The Senate, and Palpatine in particular, used emergency powers to centralize authority and steer military strategy. The Jedi, already at the crossroads of policy and force, cooperated with those directives, taking missions shaped by Senate priorities, and in the process, blurring the distinction between independent guardian and arm of the state. This entanglement made it politically costly for the Order to confront the Chancellor. Challenges could be framed as insubordination, incitement, or attempted coups, accusations that, in wartime, threatened the Republic's fragile legitimacy. Operational demands also forced moral compromises. On campaign, the Jedi authorized strikes and maneuvers that cost civilian lives and required ruthless calculation. Leading clones, soldiers engineered and conditioned for obedience, demanded a doctrine of command that sometimes clashed with Jedi ethics. The Order's emphasis on detachment and duty could be turned, in practice, into an ends justify the means posture. Because the Jedi discouraged expression of personal motives, they had fewer institutional mechanisms for acknowledging or correcting the moral cost of those choices. Failures tended to be framed as individual moral lapses, rather than system failures needing procedural reform. Council structure amplified these problems. A small, centralized body prized by confident, immediate judgment could function well in peacekeeping, but proved brittle in a political crisis that required slow, plural deliberation and public accountability. Intelligence about Palpatine's maneuvers and the clones' origins arrived in fragments. The Council oscillated between suspicion and paralysis. Institutional caution and concern for legal legitimacy delayed decisive measures until options had narrowed. Politically, all of this fed the narrative the Sith exploited. The Jedi were either out of step with the Republic's needs or dangerously powerful. It became easy to portray them as partisan actors rather than neutral guardians. That shift in perception undercut the Order's moral authority just as their practical power peaked. Tight integration with the Republic's military and political machinery left them exposed to instruments of control. The clones' conditioning and the Chancellor's accumulated emergency powers among them. Seen together, these aren't isolated failures, but a chain of small, defensible compromises that produce structural vulnerability. The transition into military command, tacit acceptance of political prerogatives, centralized secrecy, and emotional blind spots didn't create Palpatine, but they furnished him with tools. Authority over an army the Jedi did not control, a political system centralized enough to be seized, and an order ill-prepared to respond without risking the Republic itself. The very strengths that had made the Jedi effective, discipline, unity, moral certainty, became liabilities. By the time the cracks showed, the Order lacked the flexibility, political standing, and internal mechanisms needed to reform. Those conditions made organized betrayal catastrophic rather than recoverable. When the moment came, it was quick and total. Order 66 wasn't a battlefield defeat so much as a built-in switch. A single command turned soldiers who had fought as allies into assassins. Whatever debate exists about who embedded those controls, the result on the ground was unmistakable. Across planets, ships, and temples, whole Jedi contingents were cut down before they could organize a coherent defense. The shock of betrayal multiplied the damage. Jedi trained to trust structure, obey procedure, and avoid aggressive preemption were left stunned when the systems they relied on collapsed. Confusion, isolation, and a lack of political cover turned what might have been a survivable crisis into near extermination. Survivor accounts give the clearest picture of how fragile the Order had become. A few masters escaped by luck, speed, or unusual circumstance. Some went into exile, others vanished into the Republic's wreckage. Their testimonies converge on 2 points: The betrayal felt procedural, troops they had trained obeying a secret override, and the Order had very few tools to respond in the moment. Under fire, Jedi tried to answer a basic, paralyzing question. Were they under attack from an external enemy, or had the Republic itself turned on them? That uncertainty was the leverage their opponents needed. The aftermath was as much informational as physical. The new regime moved quickly to control the story. Jedi were declared traitors who had attempted a coup, and the Purge was framed as a necessary defense of stability. Records were altered or destroyed, witnesses silenced, and the organizational memory of who the Jedi had been was replaced with propaganda. The mechanism that made the Purge effective in the field, centralized command and obedient troops, was mirrored in the information war. A sudden legal and rhetorical inversion turned protectors into rebels, shrinking public sympathy and making any political comeback nearly impossible. What these events expose is not a single failing assignable to one person, but a chain of structural vulnerabilities. The Order's deep integration with the Republic's military tied its fate to matters of state. Its reliance on centralized authority, an elite council that made secretive, swift decisions, created single points of failure. Its cultural emphasis on emotional discipline and detachment produced blind spots around grievance and manipulation. When crisis arrived, those features worked against the Order. Military-style command folded under a legalistic override, secretive leadership struggled to mobilize public defense, and a culture that prized non-attachment made frank political confrontation unlikely. Accountability, or the lack of it, is central to that failure. During the Clone Wars, the Council handled discipline internally and often in secrecy. Anakin's growing fear and frustration, for example, remained largely a private concern long before outsiders could weigh in. Major decisions, accepting military command, backing covert operations, maintaining sensitive knowledge, were treated as moral necessities within the Order, not matters for public scrutiny. With no transparent review or civic oversight, legitimate criticism had nowhere to land, and small compromises went unexamined. By the time the pattern became clear, the Order's institutional capital, moral credibility, public trust, political allies, had eroded. That erosion reshapes how culpability should be assigned. Palpatine engineered and executed the coup, and his intent and brutality are central to the story. But he did so on a foundation that made his work possible: a reliable military force under legal control of the Republic, an elite leadership that could be portrayed as conspiratorial, and an internal culture that made the Jedi hesitant to mount a public response without risking civil war. This isn't absolution of the Emperor, it is an institutional critique. The Order's strengths, discipline, unity, moral certainty, also made it brittle, and that brittleness turned a coup into near annihilation. The moral landscape after the Purge was uneven. Some survivors retreated into penitent isolation, haunted by guilt and by the knowledge that institutional choices had helped enable the disaster. Others became fugitives, vigilantes, or teachers in hiding. With the Empire controlling law and narrative, there was no viable avenue for public reckoning, no forum to examine decisions, admit mistakes openly, or rebuild with safeguards. The Senate, independent courts, and a free press were being dismantled or repurposed, so large-scale accountability never happened. Memory fractured into personal stories of heroism and failure, rather than a collective truth-telling that might have produced reform. That absence of reform had lasting consequences. When an elite body is wiped out without a process for correction, the social role it served disappears or is replaced by something antagonistic. The void left by the Jedi did not produce healthier institutions. It empowered a regime that normalized secrecy, obedience, and unchecked authority. Because the Jedi had not built robust mechanisms for external accountability while they held power, there was no roadmap for rebuilding an order that could serve the Republic without repeating the same mistakes. Seen this way, the fall of the Jedi becomes less a single tragic betrayal and more the inevitable endpoint of accumulated institutional choices. The Purge was the violent conclusion of compromises that, one by one, reduced the Order's ability to adapt, to be transparent, and to answer publicly for its actions. Palpatine exploited real, consequential weaknesses that the Order helped create. The moral truth after the ashes is uncomfortable. The Jedi were victims, but they were also an organization whose policies and practices made their own destruction possible. That realization narrows the space for simple absolution and forces a harder question: what accountable power looks like when an institution claims moral authority over a civilization. The Jedi were not simply victims of a single betrayal. They were an institution whose structure helped make that betrayal possible. For generations, the Order combined spiritual authority, political influence, and a culture of moral certainty while resisting external scrutiny. That concentration of power, a preference for doctrine over debate, and an absence of clear public accountability left the Jedi brittle when crises demanded adaptation. Palpatine exploited those exact weaknesses, turning the Order's strengths, discipline, secrecy, legitimacy, into liabilities. The result was not only the Purge, but the replacement of a flawed guardian with a far worse regime. The dark truth behind the Jedi Order is this: moral purity without mechanisms for oversight and reform breeds fragility, and fragility can be weaponized. Reading the saga with that in mind changes the Jedi from untouchable saints into a cautionary example about power, responsibility, and institutional hubris.